At my own 40th wedding anniversary party, my son stood up, pointed straight at my wife and me, and said, "You have 24 hours to leave this house." Not in anger, not in private, but in front of dozens of guests. I looked at my wife, who had just recovered from illness, and I smiled, because in that moment I knew something clearly. He thought he had won, and I had just closed a very old door. But before I go on, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which country you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to that night, to the moment when everything began to turn in a direction no one saw coming. That afternoon, the air at the estate felt heavier than the Savannah summer heat. I was used to parties, polite congratulations, practiced handshakes, but that day was different. I stood up with a glass of wine in my hand, planning to say just a few simple words about 40 years with Margaret. I had rehearsed it carefully in my head, because my wife had just come through a long period of weakness and illness. I wanted everything to pass gently. I hadn't even finished my first sentence when Brandon cut me off. The way he stood up wasn't rushed at all. He pulled out his chair, straightened his suit jacket, and looked around the room as if this were the moment he had been waiting for. I noticed the change immediately. Not because of what he said, but because of his eyes. The eyes of someone who had already decided to slam a door shut, without ever looking back. He announced that the estate was now under new management, that Margaret and I needed to pack our things and leave within one day. He said it calmly, like he was announcing a home repair schedule. No request, no hesitation. The room went silent. I could hear glasses touching the table, the steady hum of the air conditioning. Margaret squeezed my hand. That hand was thinner than before, but still warm. I could feel her confusion, the confusion of someone who had always believed that family was the safest place of all. Brandon held up a piece of paper. He said it was a property management authorization, a legal document, with Margaret's signature on it. I looked at that signature and understood immediately. The ink trembled slightly. It wasn't my wife's usual handwriting. I remembered that time clearly. Margaret was in her hospital bed, drifting in and out, the world around her blurred and distant. I had asked Brandon to help his mother with a few simple administrative matters. I had trusted him. Tiffany was sitting beside him. She didn't say a word. She only gave a slight nod, her eyes avoiding the old friends she knew through me. Her silence said more than any explanation ever could. I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. I didn't make my case. I just looked at Margaret. She was trying to understand what was happening, but her face wasn't panicked. It was only sad, a quiet sadness, like realizing something precious has been lost and can never be taken back. I smiled at her, a very small smile. Then I turned to Brandon. I congratulated him, not with sarcasm, but with the voice of a man who had waited a long time for this moment. I told him that he no longer had to pretend, that today, in front of everyone, he had finally said out loud what he had always been thinking. I placed a small memory card on the table right next to his wine glass. No explanation, no threat. I only told him he should watch it later. Not today, not in front of the guests. Some truths don't need to be opened at a celebration. Then I took Margaret's hand. We left the room in silence. Behind us, I could hear the whispers beginning to rise. Old friends watched us go, their faces filled with shock and confusion. I didn't turn around. I had spent my whole life preserving this family's dignity. That night, I no longer had any obligation to do so. In my old study, where the smell of wood was still the same as the day I first moved in, Margaret sat down in a chair. She asked me a question, very softly, very slowly. She asked if she had done something wrong. I answered immediately. Without thinking, I told her she had done nothing wrong at all. Her only mistake, if there was one, was believing that silence and endurance are always repaid with gratitude. I didn't tell her that I had been preparing for this day, not because I was clever, but because when you live long enough, you learn how to listen to the things that are never said out loud. 6 months earlier, I had heard things no father should ever hear from his own son, and I chose to stay silent. That night, Brandon and Tiffany walked into my study wearing the faces of people who believed everything was already settled. They carried that document with them, convinced that one signature was enough to close the door on the lives of 2 old people. They raised their voices when they saw me gathering old family photographs. not to keep them, but to bring something to an end. I didn't burn them out of anger. I did it because some memories have already fulfilled their purpose. And I knew that when that small flame went out, another truth would come into the open. A truth Brandon had never imagined, and one he had never prepared himself to face. When the study door closed behind them, the noise of the party outside disappeared. All that remained was the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of my own breathing. Brandon thought that night marked the beginning of his power. For me, it was only a marker, the point where a chain of memories I had delayed for far too long finally came back. 6 months earlier, things weren't so clear. Margaret had just passed through the worst stage of her illness. She would drift off in the middle of a sentence, sometimes confuse the days of the week. I let Brandon and Tiffany take turns coming by the house to help. I trusted them, not out of innocence, but because I had always believed that children would never cross a certain line. One afternoon I came home earlier than planned. I stood outside the kitchen and heard them talking, not whispering, not arguing, but speaking in a calculated, emotionless tone, like they were discussing an inanimate asset. Tiffany said that placing Margaret in a low-cost care facility would be more efficient in the long run. Brandon replied that everything would be fine, as long as the paperwork was signed at the right time. They mentioned my old watch collections, calling them dead capital. They spoke about this estate as if I had been gone for years. I stood there and didn't walk in, not out of fear, but because I wanted to hear clearly. Some truths only reveal themselves when people believe no one is listening anymore. That evening, I didn't say a word to Margaret. She had just woken from a long, heavy sleep, her eyes still exhausted. I didn't want to plant more confusion in such a fragile moment. I chose silence, and I began to observe. I noticed Brandon started asking about old accounts, about ownership, about investments I rarely talked about. He thought I was an outdated man, living on a pension and memories. He didn't know that for many years I had never truly left the financial world. I had simply stepped aside, into a place with less spotlight. Brandon's real estate company grew fast, too fast for his actual capabilities. I knew because I had seen the numbers long before they appeared in the press, not as a father, but as an anonymous investor. I didn't do it to control my son. I did it because at the time, I still believed that quiet support was the best way to help him stand on his own. But then I saw money disappearing through paths that made no sense. Careless decisions, projects inflated by promises instead of substance. I began to understand that Brandon wasn't just trying to escape the responsibility of caring for his parents. He was running from a hole far bigger than that. An old acquaintance called me, speaking carefully about some questionable crypto investments Brandon had joined. I didn't ask questions. I simply checked. And what I found left me with no hesitation. Brandon was carrying a debt he couldn't resolve on his own. To him, this estate wasn't a home. It was an exit. The document Margaret signed that day wasn't an accident. It was one link in a plan that had been prepared in advance. Brandon knew the timing. Tiffany knew how to apply pressure. They waited for Margaret to be at her weakest, and for me to be absent, to close a door they believed I could never reopen. I began collecting everything, quietly, without confrontation. I saved recordings, messages, appointments that were deliberately delayed. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it because when a child is willing to exploit his own mother's weakness, every other boundary becomes only a matter of time. The night before the anniversary party, I sat alone in the study. I looked at old photographs, at faces that once believed family was something you never had to guard against. I knew Brandon would choose that day, a day with many witnesses, a day he believed I wouldn't react. When I placed that memory card on the table in front of him, it wasn't an impulse. It was a final reminder that I had seen everything, and that I was still giving him a chance to stop, if he was clear-headed enough to recognize it. But Brandon didn't stop. He followed me into the study with the expression of someone who believed everything was finished. Tiffany stood behind him, her eyes no longer able to hide her impatience. They believed one piece of paper was enough to erase 40 years. I looked at them and understood that this was no longer a story about ownership. It was the story of a son who had chosen to turn his back on his own roots. And when someone has gone that far, the only thing left to do isn't to hold on. It's to reveal the truth, layer by layer, until there is nothing left to hide. I placed my hand on the desk and took a slow breath. I knew that from that moment on, nothing could ever return to the way it was. And yet in that same instant, I felt lighter. Because the silence I had carried for 6 long months was finally about to end. The silence in the study lasted long enough for me to hear the clock marking every single second. Brandon was the one who broke it. He placed the authorization document on the desk and slid it toward me, like a conclusion that didn't require discussion. His voice was sharper than it had been at the party. The calm was gone. Tiffany stood close to the door, her eyes moving quickly around the room, as if she were already looking for a way out. I didn't touch the paper. I stood up, opened a drawer, and took out a thin folder. Not thick, not complicated. I set it on the desk parallel to Brandon's document. Then I said slowly that perhaps they had the wrong address. Brandon let out a dry laugh. He said everything was already clear, that his mother's signature was enough to end the story, that I should accept reality and leave quietly to save face. I listened, and for the first time that night, I felt sorry for him. Not because I was soft, but because he was speaking like someone who had believed in something that never truly existed. I told him that this estate had never been in my name, and it had never been in Margaret's name either. I said it the way one states an obvious fact. Brandon froze. Tiffany turned to look at him, then back at me. I continued. No raised voice, no emphasis. I said that 10 years earlier, I had transferred full ownership into a trust. A simple name, no show. In Margaret's name, the paper in Brandon's hands suddenly seemed lighter. He flipped it over, scanned every line, as if hoping to find something I had missed. But nothing changed. That document only allowed control over a different asset, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, something I had kept for this exact purpose. I don't call that a trap. I call it preparation. Brandon raised his voice. He accused me of deceiving my own son. Tiffany stepped forward, her tone tight, asking what else I was holding back. I looked straight at her and said that I was holding the truth. And the truth doesn't need to be shouted. I took out the memory card I had placed on the table at the party. I didn't play it. I told them what was on it. Not in detail, just enough for them to understand. Recordings. Moments when Margaret wasn't fully aware. Voices pressuring her, guiding her hand to sign, and a haste that couldn't be hidden. Tiffany stepped back. Brandon went silent. This silence was different. It wasn't the silence of confidence anymore. It was the silence of someone who had just realized he'd crossed a line, and there was no way back. I told them I didn't want to play those recordings in this room. I said I was still hoping they would stop on their own, not because I was afraid, but because Margaret deserved peace. But if they continued, I would send everything to the people whose job it was to review it. No further explanation needed. Brandon looked at me, anger and confusion mixed in his eyes. He asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted nothing. I only wanted them to leave this house that very night. No arguments, no delays, and not to take anything that didn't belong to them. In that moment, I saw Tiffany begin to calculate. She looked at Brandon the way one looks at an investment that's losing value. I didn't need to hear her speak to understand. Some decisions are made with a glance, faster than any conversation. Margaret entered the room then. She stood in the doorway, her body still weak, but her back straight. She didn't ask what was happening. She just looked at Brandon for a long time. Then she took the watch off her wrist. The watch I had once given our son on a special occasion and later noticed had disappeared. She placed it on the desk in front of Brandon. She said she had found it in Tiffany's coat pocket. She said she didn't need an explanation. Some answers were already clear enough. Brandon lowered his head, not in regret, but because there was nothing left to say. Tiffany turned away. She didn't look back. I opened the study door. I told them they had 10 minutes. No more, no less. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. When they left, the room returned to silence. I looked at Margaret. She didn't cry. She simply let out a long breath, like someone setting down a burden she had carried for far too long. I knew it wasn't over. What had just happened was only another door opening. Behind it were consequences Brandon hadn't yet imagined. But in that old room, surrounded by the smell of wood and the warm yellow light, I understood something very clearly. Some confrontations don't need noise. When the truth is placed in the right spot, every illusion collapses on its own. After the door closed, I thought the quiet would last. But some things don't stop just because people leave a room. That night I didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but because I knew Brandon wouldn't accept an ending that easy. He had never been used to walking away with nothing. Near dawn, my phone vibrated. Not a call, an automated alert. One of the systems I've monitored for years had just flagged a series of unusual access requests. I wasn't surprised. Brandon was trying to move money. Not to invest, but to run. He chose the fastest route. Internal transfers, rushed packaging, large amounts, paired with vague explanations. I stared at the screen, read each line, and let out a slow breath. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had expected. No more, no less. Except for one thing. This time, the system didn't allow it. The accounts Brandon believed were his alone were locked one by one. Not because of a technical error, but because of an old clause, activated at the right moment. That clause allowed a strategic advisor to intervene when serious risk was detected. Brandon had never bothered to ask who stood behind that title. He only cared about the outcome. I closed the laptop when I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Margaret stood there, wrapped in a light cardigan, her face calmer than I expected. She didn't ask what I was doing. She only said she had woken up, and everything felt clear, much clearer than it had in months. We sat at the kitchen table. I made tea. Margaret held the cup with both hands. She said she was remembering pieces now, moments when Tiffany rushed papers toward her, the urging voices, the times Brandon avoided her eyes. She said that at her weakest, she had trusted them, and that hurt her more than any illness ever had. I didn't try to comfort her. I knew she didn't need that. She only needed to hear that she wasn't alone in the truth. The next afternoon, Brandon came back. Tiffany wasn't with him. He stood outside the gate, his posture collapsed, the confidence from the night before gone. He said his company was having issues. He asked if I knew what was happening. I invited him in, not because I wanted to talk, but because some things need to be ended in daylight. I told him that what was falling apart wasn't an accident. It was the result of decisions he had made long ago. I said I hadn't frozen anything. I had simply stopped shielding him. And when the shield disappears, everything underneath shows itself for what it is. Brandon sat down, his hands clasped together. He said that if I helped him this time, things would be different. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I told him this was the last time I would help him. By not helping anymore. Margaret walked in then. She was holding a small box. She opened it and placed the watch on the table. The watch Brandon had taken and never mentioned again. She slid it toward him and said she had bought it back with her own money. Not as repayment, but to close something. She looked at Brandon for a long time. Then she said she had raised a man. But the person she saw now was no longer someone she recognized. She said that from that day on she would no longer wait for any promises. No accusations. No holding on. Brandon lowered his head. I don't know what was in his mind. I only know he had lost the last thing money could never replace. Tiffany appeared not long after. She didn't come inside. She stood by the gate and called Brandon out. Their conversation was short. Very short. I saw Tiffany hand him a stack of papers. I didn't need to look to know what they were. When a ship starts to sink, people look for a way to jump first. A few days later, I learned that Tiffany had chosen to cooperate with those reviewing Brandon's financial matters. She chose to save herself. I wasn't surprised. Some people never see family as an anchor. To them, it's only a tool. Brandon's company collapsed as quickly as it had been built. Partners turned away. Projects were shut down. There was no loud explosion, just a series of doors closing, one by one, without negotiation. That night I stood in the study and looked at the house one last time, as a space that had completed its purpose. I didn't feel victory. I only felt the end of a long illusion. Margaret stood beside me. She held my hand. She didn't say a word. And in that moment I understood something clearly. What mattered most wasn't what Brandon had lost. It was what we had managed to keep. Our quiet, our truth, and the right to walk away without carrying bitterness with us. After all the doors had closed, I realized I had no reason left to stay at that estate. The house had witnessed too much silence. And silence, when it lasts too long, becomes a burden of its own. I didn't want the rest of my life anchored to a place that only reminded me of what had fractured. Margaret felt the same. She didn't say much. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the old porch, she rested her hand on the wooden railing and said she no longer felt this was home. Her words were soft, but final, and that was enough. We decided to sell the estate. Not because we needed the money, but because we didn't want it to become a symbol of bitterness. Most of the proceeds went into a local charity that supports families caring for elderly loved ones long term. Margaret signed the final documents herself. This time, her signature was steady, clear, no longer trembling. On the day we left Savannah, there was no farewell party. No friends invited, no announcements, just 2 suitcases, a few old books, and the essentials. I locked the door one last time, placed the keys in the agent's hand, and walked away. I didn't look back. We moved to a small wooden house by the coast of Oregon. No high fences, no iron gates. Just ocean wind, the sharp scent of salt, and the steady rhythm of the waves. On our first morning there, Margaret woke up before I did. She made coffee, opened the windows, and let the light fill the room. I watched her and realized it had been a long time since I'd seen her this calm. Our life slowed down. No crowded schedules. No calls we had to debate answering. I fixed up a small old boat I bought from a neighbor. Margaret planted a few rows of flowers by the porch. Each task was small, but together they were enough to fill a day. From time to time I think about Brandon. Not with anger, but with distance. Like remembering a road I once traveled but will never return to. I hear he's living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, taking temporary work, staying away from places that once called him a rising star. I don't ask for details. I don't block the news either. I just let it pass through. Margaret has never said she hates her son. She only says she learned something late in life, that love cannot replace boundaries, and forgiveness, if it comes, needs time to find its own way. One afternoon, as we walked along the shoreline, Margaret held my hand and asked if I had any regrets. I thought for a long time before answering. I told her that if anything weighed on me, it wasn't what happened. It was how long I stayed silent. I believed endurance would protect the family, but sometimes that very silence feeds misunderstandings that grow far larger. I told her that during my years as an engineer, I learned something simple. If a small crack is ignored, it spreads. Not because someone intends to destroy anything, but because no one is willing to face it early enough. Families are no different. Margaret nodded. She said she didn't want to carry resentment into the rest of her life. She only wanted to live the days she had left with clarity, clear about what to hold on to and what to let go. That evening, we sat on the porch and watched the sun slowly sink into the ocean. I thought about the old watch, about the photographs that had finished their role. I didn't feel loss. I felt light. Some legacies don't live in safes or legal documents. They live in how a person walks away without carrying hatred. If there's one thing I want to say to anyone listening to this story, it's this. Don't mistake apparent silence for weakness. Often we stay silent because we love our children. But there comes a moment when we must act, not to punish, but to protect our truth and our dignity. Money can buy a house, but it cannot buy back dignity once it's been disregarded. And family, if it isn't built on respect, will eventually be nothing more than a name. The ocean breeze was gentle. Margaret rested her head on my shoulder. I held her hand tightly. Ahead of us, there were no grand plans, just ordinary days moving slowly forward. And after everything, that ordinary life was exactly what we had been waiting for all along. If you've stayed with this story to the end, thank you for taking the time to listen. If it made you reflect or touched something within your own family, please like, subscribe, and share so stories like this can reach more people. Your support is the reason I keep telling these stories. Slowly, honestly, one at a time. Thank you for staying until the very end.